Hello everyone and welcome to At the Races. We are going to enjoy a whip debate this afternoon. The future of British racing is at stake. The BHA are reviewing the whip rules and they may have far more reaching consequences than any levy negotiations or tariff values. This is what we're going to be talking about today. This is the modern whip, fully padded. You can prick yourself pretty hard. And it doesn't hurt too much, but it does sting a little bit. Joined me in the studio today is John McCririck, a pundit who you will know well and is fairly outspoken on most subjects. Good afternoon to you, John.
Yeah.
And former top jockey John Reid. Welcome to the show, John. Let's let the viewers know straight away what side of the fence you two as pundits are sitting on. John, what is your stance with the whip?
Well, I believe that we still tolerate the whipping of horses. I think it shames the whole of us who enjoy the sport we love. There's nowhere else can you hit a living creature. So the whip degrades us all and turns off people who would love to join the racing family.
OK, that's John's stance. John Reid, you're a former top jockey. What do you make of the whip in the modern era?
Well, I think the whip has come a long way, the way we use it, and the type of whip we use nowadays doesn't actually hurt a horse and certainly doesn't damage a horse. I think racing would be a lot worse if we didn't have whips, and I'm very pro keeping them.
We've got 4 different whips here. There are 4 different whips. These 2 here are the modern day whips. These are the old style whips. John, I'm going to give them to you. Can you explain to the viewers what's changed, how it's changed and how it's made things different?
These are the old whips. These are the ones that I used most of my career. And this was a modified, originally they were much thinner than this, and they would actually hurt a horse. They would actually cut them in the old days. But they made these a little bit thicker, and the rule was brought in, and they have something on the weighing room when you weigh out that you put the stick in, it has to conform. So it can't be any thinner than that. But these are the old whips, and these do hurt. I'm not saying they don't, they do hurt. If you got a smack across the backside with that, it would make you jump a bit.
Yeah.
But that was the way they were.
And that's the type of whip you used to ride with?
That's what I rode with all my career, that type of whip. I mean, they varied a bit, but that was the type of whip I was.
And in your career, which spanned how many years? 30 years?
Well, I started in 73, I rode my first winner. So, yeah, quite a few years.
And putting the cards on the table, how many times in that career would you say you'd marked a horse with the whip you were using, say?
Yeah, there were times when you marked them. Certain horses are what they call thin-skinned, or they're very sweaty, and sometimes you mark them.
Okay.
Laterally, I learned to use the whip better, and we were better educated on the whip, and we didn't hurt them so much and didn't hit them so much, which was a good thing.
Okay, so we know the old whip is relatively harsh. We all accept that.
Definitely.
What about this new type of whip that we're using now, which is foam covered? It's got a leather casing, but it's still got a hardish strip in the middle of it.
Yes, I mean, it's still a whip. Whatever way you look at it, it is still a whip. And the whip's there to actually, you've got to be honest about it. It's there to frighten a horse.
Yeah.
It's to make them go and keep them going. And but these are completely different to what we had before. I mean, these are quite soft. I don't think these would actually hurt any horse. Or this one here is a National Hunt whip. It's got a huge piece of foam almost all the way up. Now, I'd be very, very surprised if that damaged anything.
Okay. John, you're huffing and puffing. What's your problem at this stage of the debate?
I think you take the prisoner down with John. He said we're there to frighten a horse.
Yeah.
It's just what he said. You can play back the tape.
Right.
And that's just what it does. It frightens a horse. But even worse, you have different shapes of whip and how much they hurt a horse. It's the perception. A.P. McCoy said that. What the public think. How can we go on with a sport that hits an animal? No one else goes and does it. And listen, I ask the question of everybody. If the whip had never been invented, and somebody comes along, I know how we'll make horses go fast, we'll whip them. There'd be outrage. Nobody say anything, wouldn't even think about it. I could now say, I'll make horses go faster, we'll put electrodes on their private parts and they'll jerk forward. We'd be horrified. But John says it himself, to frighten the horse.
So would you just get rid of horse racing completely? Just abandon the sport?
It's nothing to do with horse racing and getting rid of it. Of course it's not.
Right. But we know you can't...
You carry a whip for steering purposes in the reins and you don't hit it. Absolutely. And nobody objects to that.
So you think horses naturally race, do you?
Not naturally race, but they race when they're being ridden.
But you think that? What evidence do you have of that?
We have races without the whip now. Hands and heels races, that the Betfair sponsor a series as well. Absolutely fine. The racing goes on.
But that's for jockeys who don't know
I
how
would
to
say
ride,
to
isn't
you, more races are lost because of the whip than one bite. One bite, you look at head on, horses veer away from it, as you would do. The number of races that are lost because it's hang away from the whip are far more than those that are won. People
This
bring
isn't
up
a debate about whether it causes interference. It's a debate about perception.
Yes, perception.
Yeah.
Even
Interference
worse.
is a different
No,
issue.
no, but they're both issues. People, racing people say, the Minstrel and Roberto wouldn't have won their derbies without Lester Piggott's ferocious rat-a-tat-tat. So what? And I'll bring it up to John as well. The man I think really is involved in this. High Rise's derby with City Honours. Now, High Rise, Pellier, he lashed into that horse. He got 2 or 3 days suspension, whatever it was, even in those days in 98. You didn't. That cost you the derby because you rode within the rules. You were beaten ahead. Now, there is something wrong.
Is that true, John? Or did you just ride your horse to the maximum?
I rode my horse to the maximum. I don't think if I'd have hit him another 20 times would have made any difference.
Aye,
I had my horse
you
running.
proved the case.
I had my horse running flat out.
My case is proved.
So
But
you
I
don't
still
want
had the
horses
whip.
to respond to
I
the
still
whip?
had the whip.
No, but my case is proved. As John has said, first of all, it's to frighten a horse. That's the number one he's condemned for.
course it is.
Secondly, he said he's beaten ahead. If it hit it 20 more times, he wouldn't have won the race. Beaten only ahead by High Rise, who was thrashed to death by Pellier. That convinces you don't need it.
But again, you're using...
So
No,
there we
John,
are.
I've got to butt in here. You cannot come in here and use language like he was thrashed to death. That is
Well,
just
it was
factually
awful to see.
incorrect.
It was awful
but
to see
if
it.
you talk like
Yeah.
that, John,
It was
then the
awful to see
people
it.
watching this show now are
was
not
awful.
going to take anything you say seriously. High Rise was not thrashed
It
to
was a
death.
vicious beating
No,
he
no,
was
no,
given.
no,
It was
no,
horrible.
we've just got to bring this down
and
to
John
a
lost the
sensible
race
level.
because he was a gentleman.
Yeah.
He kept within the rules.
But that's
Simple as
fine.
that. And John says he didn't.
That's
so
fine.
do you need the whip? Did you need it at all?
I used the whip in the derby.
Yes.
I used the whip.
But within the guidelines.
I used my whip to get my horse into top gear
Yeah.
and keep him in top gear. Now, I don't think, and I've just said, no matter how many times more I hit him, I don't think he could have went any faster. He was going as fast as he could. Now, that is, I'll believe that until the day I die. Now, Pesley maybe hit it more,
He did.
and he did, but I'm not sure that it made his horse go any faster. He probably would have beaten me anyway.
You see what you if as
You
you're
condemn
as,
yourself.
no no no
I'm
no,
not
no
condemning
just
myself,
wait
that's
for a
the
sec.
fact.
As we'll discover during this program today, almost every professional you speak to will say that once you've used the whip a certain number of times, you won't get anything more out of it. So John's argument that the more you hit it, the faster you go, John, for me is I'm saying Big Mac here rather than you, John. His argument that if you hit it 50 times, it will go faster than if you hit it 4 times is flawed by almost every racing professional you speak to.
Exactly.
That they say maybe Pellier did overdo it and he got banned for it. But to suggest because he hit it 50 times, indeed you could actually argue the opposite, that probably High Rise went slower because of the frequent uses. Because every professional, and you're not a horsey professional, every professional you speak to says it's worth hitting them once, it's worth hitting them twice, 3 times. But there is a point where it makes no difference and it actually was more likely to hinder than help. John, what would you say
It
to
comes
that?
back to what I said a minute ago, although John here pulled me up on it, fear. Now, horses are naturally run for fear. They don't run because they want to run. They are an animal that runs for fear. They've got eyes all the way around because of one reason. They're not predators. They get preyed upon. So they only
You run into a field, horses disperse, don't they? That's
run.
it. They're scared of you. They run into it. And that is essentially what a jockey is trying to give the impression of, that you've got to run for your life.
Yeah. So we're trying to frighten them to make them run fast. That's all.
Well, this is getting worse and worse. We agree.
But this is the point with your
the
argument,
whip does make
effectively,
a horse. A
there
horse
is no
would
horse
go
racing.
quicker to the winning post when it's being whipped. We agree with it. How many times you can argue whether it's 3, 4, 10, whatever it is, the strokes in many horses, not all, but in many horses do make it go fast.
Because
You
horses
see,
are herd animals who'll stay
but
together.
I am a total convert. I used to be a whipman. I used to be in a betting shop or on the racehorse. One more time, go drive it, go on. My money was down, and suddenly I realised, what am I doing here? What am I doing encouraging people to hit horses? And we've now got the terrible position that jockeys, to prove they're macho, men and women jockeys, to prove they're macho, to prove they're trying, have got to hit horses because the public will say, oh, they're not trying.
But again,
That
you're
is
using
disgusting.
you're using emotive language,
It's
which you
true.
have no. There is
true.
no jockey I've ever spoken to in my life who said, "I'm going to try and prove I'm macho this
They have
afternoon by
to.
hitting a horse."
If they don't, what will people like you say?
Are there jockeys in the weighing room today saying, as they go racing at Newmarket, etc., thinking, I'm going to be macho today. And it's ridiculous.
It is not.
The language you're using is ridiculous to the debate.
Because you don't like it. Because you're wrong. That's why you don't like the language
I'm here just
using.
to provide
because it's the truth.
Conversation.
It's
It doesn't
the truth.
matter what I like.
Jockeys don't. I don't. You know, macho. What would they want to? Why would they want to be seen as macho?
Because they're not accused. They'd otherwise be accused of not trying. If you don't hit a horse now, you're accused. Oh, you're not doing your best. You're hooking it up. That's disgusting. That we've reached
You're
the position.
treating the public very naively.
Well,
if you
that's
think,
what they say. You know what they say more than I do on your emails and your faxes and your Twitters and your tweets and all that. You know more than I do.
But no one's ever emailed in and said, I want my horse butchered this afternoon,
Not
which is
butchered.
what you're suggesting.
Well, why use emotive language like that? Look at you.
Because this is what you've just... Oh. Right, OK. OK, we'll work for a short break. And after the break, we're going to experience whipless racing. Located at the head of the Oslo fjord, just a 15-minute drive west of the city centre and the famous Holmenkollen ski jump, is a racecourse unique in its own way, where the horses do battle with a subtle difference. It's hard to imagine British racing without whips, the hugely padded sticks used by jockeys for safety reasons and to encourage horses to run like the wind. Many punters and riders feel that whips are essential in order for most horses to perform to their best, but others simply find striking any animal unacceptable. So what would whip-free racing be like? We've come to Norway, to Oslo's Overall racecourse to find out. It's 1,000 guineas day and whips are totally outlawed. Hans-Peter Eriksson is the chief at Overall Racecourse. I wanted to initially find out exactly why the whip had been taken away.
Well, it happened in 1982, almost 30 years ago, when the government issued a new law against cruelty to animals. One paragraph said that the use of whip in horse racing is forbidden. And what we did, we persuaded them to allow the jockeys to have a short whip and use it only to avoid dangerous situation. If they used it to make a horse go faster, automatically disqualified.
Really?
And from beginning of season 2009, we took the whip away. So today they ride in all flat races for 3-year-olds and upwards without whip.
So Hans, there'll be no whips today?
No, only 2-year-old races, just for safety reasons and in jump races.
And initially, what was the jockey's reaction?
Riders were not very happy, but I think they're used to it now. The good thing is that the trainers, they have accepted it and it works.
So the jockeys weren't totally with the idea. What about the punters? Were punters discouraged from backing horses when they felt perhaps that the jockeys couldn't throw everything at them?
Never heard anything like that. They compete at level terms, you know. Nobody has a whip with them, and it works. So, and the favourites win about 30% of the races.
So what you're saying, Hans, is that before the whip and after the whip was banned, it's exactly the same percentage of favourites that have been winning, 30%.
The same as before, and the same percentage as in Sweden and Denmark as well. And another good thing is that we have very little interferences in racing, so it's been a lot easier for the stewards and the public. They like it.
Do you think whip-free racing is a good thing?
I'm sure, you know, and I think it's very important in the future. If we're going to attract new young people to racing, we have to get rid of the whip, I think. Especially with the big screens on every race course, you know, and high definition TV, you see absolutely everything. And people don't like to see horses getting hit.
That's interesting you say that, because those who want the whip banned back home believe that it will attract new racegoers, a new type of punter to the track. Do you have any research, or have you found that new people have come through your gates since the whip has been taken away?
I can't say that because we haven't had a sort of a survey, but it's a lot of families here, a lot of with children, so they're happy here, and I think they like it.
And just tell us a little bit about Overall Racecourse. Looking round, I see you've got a fine Hong Kong type tote board in the middle of the track.
It's very, very, very old. We bought it from Happy Valley in Hong Kong about 40 years ago, and I think we paid $1 Hong Kong for it. Shipped it to Norway, and it still works.
And I believe you've been racing here since 1932.
1932. The season is from middle of April till end of November. Due to the winter, of course, we have at least a yard of snow from early November till end of March at the racecourse. You can go skiing here in the winter. And we usually have about 38, 39 meetings a year.
The whip rules at Overall Racecourse are black and white. There's little room, if indeed any room, for interpretation. Firstly, in races, the jockey shall ride with both hands on the reins. Using the loose ends of the reins as a whip is forbidden and will be punished according to the rules of racing. Secondly, any offence against these rules may lead to the horse being disqualified and the jockey punished according to the rules of racing. Thirdly, the jockey shall, according to what is mentioned above, from the start to the winning post ride with both hands on the reins. When it comes to fines, severity is the order of the day. Professional jockeys. The first offence is a fine of Norwegian kroner 2,000 and 1 week suspension. A second offence is a fine of Norwegian kroner 5,000 and 4 weeks suspension. And finally, if the steward should find the committed offence in this respect to be of a very serious character, they may report the case to the senior stewards of the Norwegian Jockey Club. Today's Overall card served up 7 races, and they numbered plenty of familiar names, including Dingle View, who provided Kathy Gannon with a great day in Ireland, and Cat Jr. Remember him finishing 4th behind Henry the Navigator in the St James's Palace Stakes? Before we see how they got on, let's have our first taste of whip-free racing. The second event on the card was the Lord Sullivan Cup, a 1-mile handicap. We can join them at the start. Hans have been keen to stress that no whips meant less interference, and certainly there was little trouble in the early stages. Fair Flair, number 2 in the black and white, and an ex-Jare Lions inmate, soon got to the front, while those who followed John Gosden's stable should note his former Nottingham winner, Elusive Spirit, in the bright orange cap. As they turned for home, the field spread out. Presumably because without the help of a whip, taking narrow gaps at speed was less likely to pay off. I was interested in the run of Magic Cloud, who you can see towards the left of the screen. He rattles home from off the pace and looked like just the type of animal who needs more encouragement than simply pushing. The winner of the second race, Fair Flair, was ridden by Per Anders Gruberg. How does he feel about riding without a whip?
It feels like going out naked, more or less. I think. I mean, you go to the horses and it feels like you're missing something. But then again, I never rode with a whip up in Norway. It's been like this long before I started riding. So up here, I guess you get used to it, but it feels naked.
Per might feel naked, but views differ.
I actually prefer not to have a whip. I started out riding without the whip here in Norway, and that is what I'm used to. I've been out riding for entry races for amateur riders, and I used the whip there, or we have to use the whip there. But the first time I thought it was really weird hitting a horse. It's trying to run as fast as it can, and then we start hitting them. But of course, some horses need a whip to get motivated. But I think we should do this sport because the horses love it, and then the horses that actually love it should also run as fast as they can without being hit.
Well, preferably I would sooner he had a stick, because I think, especially with young horses and that sort of thing, they need a little bit of encouragement to teach them how to race. But they've had success without it here for quite a while. There's always a winner. But I mean, there's no need for jockeys to knock horses about.
It's not a big issue anymore. It was imposed on us for about 25 years ago from the Ministry of Agriculture, and that was from one day to another. It was banned, and they couldn't use the whip anymore. So the jockeys adapted quite quick. I think some of them dropped their knees a bit, back to the old style, hands and heels, and it works. It's not really a problem. Of course, obviously, there's some horses that need one or two, but I think it's too much really, because in my opinion, if you give them 1, 2, 3 slaps and there's no response, you might as well put your hands down. You won't find anything more. And some of the jockeys are playing jockeys, obviously, and do it too much, in my opinion.
The third race was the leading Creditor Cup over 1.5 miles on the artificial surface. Here, 13-year-old City of London in the black and yellow, who won at Folkestone for Pit Payne and Gary Carter no less in 2001, starts well but is soon headed by the freewheeling Onkel Blar under Madeleine Haugland. That pair stayed in front until the closing stages, when Zenkat in the yellow and black flew home for a narrow victory. Backers of Onkel Blar might have felt they would have held on if that runner had been urged with a whip, while of course those who supported the winner could argue their hope would have finished even faster if he had been given reminders. But what did Madeleine make of things? Did she believe a whip was the difference between winning and losing?
Maybe it would sharpen him a bit, but he's such a girl horse and he likes to run in front and feel like I have no control. So on this horse, I really don't think so, because he's really honest.
Little dramatic had happened by the time we came to race 6, the Norwegian 1,000 guineas featuring Dingle View, Dave Evans's former Group 3 winner in the black, yellow and red. In some ways that's the problem. Whip-free racing is so safe. It's almost too safe. In the UK, all being well, jockeys tend to sit still, ride firmly and then use the whip for one final surge. Whip-free racing misses the surge, and that, at least for me, affects the crowd. Supporters don't have a clear moment to get involved. The event just happens. Dingle View wins snugly and runs on strongly for jockey Jakob Johansson. The atmosphere issue might be attributed to the different ways in which each nation punters bet. While British backers delve deep into the form and bet mainly in the win and place markets, Norwegian punters tend to treat it more as a numbers game, preferring to play a Scoop 6 style bet known locally as the Pick 5.
The Norwegian punters are going for big money, you know, and the turnover in Pick 5 is very good. But we have, you can bet on horse to win, place, and first, second and third as well.
But would it be fair to say that in Norway, horse racing is a little bit of more of a numbers game, i.e. you might put numbers 1, 3, 5 in a race rather than try and find the best horse?
You're correct. Mm.
So that might make a little difference to how people perceive horses that aren't being encouraged with a whip. That might make a little difference.
It could be, but it works and we're very happy with it.
The big race of the night was the finale, the listed Norse Jockey Club sprint over nearly 6 furlongs featuring Cat Jr. The Norwegian champion jockey, Espen Ski, is on board the ex-Ben Case-trained Hansinger. Ski has found a different way to encourage a horse now he has no whip.
To begin with it, I was riding like everybody else, and after a while I found out that by taking a little jump and kicking the horses in the belly, during the finish, it made actually the horses respond the same way as the whip did. So I kept on doing it, and after 10 years now I've been doing it, and it's been a successful thing. So,
would you prefer though to have a whip than have to do that?
Of course, if you had a choice to have a whip or not have a whip, of course I would have preferred having a whip. But in Norway it's the rules, and it's government said no whip, so we have to follow that.
For safety reasons, I do think there's a good point in having a whip. For the use of whip here in Scandinavia, we have a different attitude than around the world, especially in Norway, and the law says we can't hit a horse. So it's all down to what we think is, for the point of safety, I think definitely they should carry, but the rule says you're not allowed to hit a horse and you will always have people that can't, they don't obey the rules. It's like driving a car. I mean, you got to obey the rules. If you all obey the rules, there'll be no traffic accidents. So it's a little bit the same problem as I see it.
So to the big race itself, in which Hansinger is in white with a red cap, and Cat Jr. in blue, red and white sleeves and a red and white cap. In the early stages, Mr. Admiral in white and black misses the break, and it's hard not to think he needs encouragement from a whip to get going, while Hurry Lime on the left in green and red is another who might have responded to more than just hands and heels. Cat Jr. is the horse to look out for. He pulls hard, tracking the leaders, and turning for home I thought he'd go for a gap on the inside of Master Chef in the black, red and yellow colours of Dingle View. It's possible, though, that without a whip, the jockey feels he can't grab the opportunity. Cat Jr. switches and closes all the way to the line. He looks like a horse crying out for serious encouragement. But of course that's hard to prove. That said, Dr. Jeremy Naylor once told me intelligent horses stay with the pack due to their herd instinct. Maybe Cat Jr. is simply too clever without having his mind made up. So what do we make of our Norwegian experience? It's fair to say the racing is far from ridiculous. Indeed, it's thoroughly professionally run. And it appears the best horses have won. But it's also fair to say that the jockeys would prefer to carry whips, even just for safety reasons. And it's the betting that really worries me. Norwegians like a Scoop 6 type numbers game. It's not all about win and place. The big question is, will British punters cope with their hard-earned cash simply being pushed from start to finish? Well, welcome back to the studio. I hope you enjoyed our feature on the racing at Oslo. It was a terrific day out, and we must thank everyone in Oslo as well. They could not have been more helpful in letting us see things and, just introduce us to people. John, what would you feel if you were still a jockey and you were told to go out without a stick?
Well, I've ridden in Norway without a whip, and I really did not like it. You feel... Like that jockey said, you feel naked. Yeah. There's nothing you can do. If a horse goes to do anything, there's absolutely nothing you can do. You've got two reins and you've got really no way of helping them any other way or stopping them running out or anything.
I thought the interference thing was interesting because there is a conception, I've read articles recently where people have said if whips are taken away there'll be a lot of interference. From that point of view, and I know the interference issue isn't the main issue, but there is no interference with whip because you can't take gaps.
I don't actually believe that's true. There'll be that a whip stops interference. I don't believe that for a moment. Right. But what it does is get your horse to keep going when they're tired or when they don't want to go. You're there to. That's your job, is to frighten horses a little bit. I mean,
this is an interesting
I get back to the frighten bit,
yeah.
But to growl at a horse or get hold of it, you're actually trying to frighten them to run because they're not going to run. They're not going to get paid at the end of the race. They're not going to get a bigger dinner because they get well fed anyway. You need to make them go. You need to motivate them, and you're the motivator.
Well, that's an interesting angle, which we may get to. So Mark Prescott was talking about actually what do horses do in their wild life. All they do is sit or sleep and eat. They don't run around fields. And I think you've hit a real crucial question there. And again, it's another issue that people in horse racing probably don't want brought up. Horses don't naturally race. This idea that you don't need to encourage a horse to take part in a horse race is ridiculous. You do. Horses don't naturally just run round in circles chasing things.
No, they only run away from danger.
Yeah.
That's why horses were evolved to be like they are with long legs, and they're flight animals. Someone scares them, they run. They don't run otherwise. Okay. So you're there to motivate them, make them run, and that's a jockey's job.
We're going to go for a short break. We're going to speak to John Ox straight after the break, and then we'll bring Big back in. So we'll have a quick breather, and one of the masters of his profession coming up, Mr. John Ox. Welcome back to the Whip Day debate here on Sky Channel 415. John Ox is a master Irish trainer. Let's not forget his father won 8 Irish Classics, and John himself is also a veterinarian. So if anyone's in a position to tell us exactly what the situation is with the well-being of horses and the whip, it's John Ox. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, Matt.
Thanks very much for coming on the show today. John, could you imagine a scenario where whips aren't used in horse racing?
No, I couldn't. I think it'd be just plain ridiculous if it ever got to that. I couldn't imagine how it would get to that situation. The whip is part and parcel of racing. There's been great progress made in recent years to educate riders and young riders in the proper use of it, and that's an ongoing process. But the whip is part and parcel of horse racing. It's part of the thoroughbred's makeup, quite frankly. Thoroughbreds respond to the whip. They're bred both to race and they're bred to respond to a flick from the whip. There's nothing new in that, and I think if you took it away, we'd lose everything, really. Horses, we want to find out what are the best horses. It's important that we find out what are the best horses, what are the toughest horses, the horses with the best temperament, as well as the best ability. It's central to the whole breeding of race horses. It's central to the whole industry, and to go out with no whips would be ridiculous. Young, inexperienced horses, 2-year-olds or 3-year-old colts that haven't raced before, for a jockey to go out and attempt to ride them with no whip would be laughable. You wouldn't get them to behave, to run straight, to behave well, to do their best. We have to remember we have an industry that revolves around precocious horses, precocious racing for precocious horses for 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. We don't have an industry that revolves around 10-year-old geldings, particularly except in National Hunt. But on the flat, we have to expect a lot from young, inexperienced horses, and they need the whip to point them in the right direction and to encourage them and to get the best out of them. So it would be, in my view, it would be the end of racing if there was no whip. By all means, we have to have continuing education of riders, and we have to have continuing supervision of it. But there's not a whole lot wrong with the situation, the way it's policed today. You have to remember one thing: the thoroughbred has been developed from the Arab horse, and the jockeys who have ridden, particularly in recent years now in Dubai, and they've ridden Arab horses, will tell you that the Arab horse doesn't like the whip. He doesn't race particularly well for the whip. And I remember Michael Kinnan telling me that he rode in a purebred Arab race one day, and then he rode in a race for half Arab, half thoroughbred horses. And he said the difference was just unbelievable, that the half thoroughbred horse was much more generous. He responded to the whip. He was much more professional about what he did. And it's evolved now that the thoroughbred, the full thoroughbred, is the same. They're bred to race and they're bred to respond to the whip. And a lot of them are waiting for that crack from the whip. It's not as if you're forcing a horse to do something that he's not willing and able to do. It's not like taking a donkey and lining up a load of donkeys and whipping the daylights out of them to go and race when they're not bred to race. They're bred to pull a cart or to carry a load. The thoroughbred is a unique creature, and he's bred to race, and it's what he does naturally. Now, I know some people say, horses you let them out in a paddock, they'll just put their head down and graze, but they'll do a bit of running around it too. They like to have a little gallop here and there, but when you put tack on them and break them in and teach them a little bit about their job, they learn it very quickly, and they learn to race, and they want to race. And the good ones, race the best and give their best and respond best to the whip, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find out what the good ones are and breed the best of the best to end up with the best. And the whip is part of that. I mean, it'd just be ridiculous to get rid of it, just because an unhorsey urban population is the norm these days, and that people are no less and less about animals and how they live and how they should be treated. Just because we're living in a different world doesn't mean that everybody should throw in the towel and not speak up for what's right.
John, just out of interest, John McCririck's one of his big arguments, which is hard to argue against, is that there is no other sport particularly that you hit an animal as such. You've got a wife and 3 children who presumably wouldn't be kids who would enjoy seeing animals hurt, living with animals all the time. How do you respond to that suggestion from John?
I don't think the animals are being hurt, you see. That's where people mistake. I mean, sure, of course, if you see somebody, doing a terrible job at the whip and hitting the horse excessively and too hard and all that, nobody wants to see that, and that needs to be clamped down on. But you're not hurting the horses, you see. That's where people, like I've seen horses who've had hard races, harder than they should have had over many years, and they still come home and they eat up and they're happy and they go out the next day and do their work. If you were hurting a horse, you won't get the best out of it, and I'm sure John Reid, who's there with you, would say that. There's no doubt excessive use of the whip doesn't make the horse run faster, and hitting a horse particularly hard doesn't make the horse run faster. Sometimes you'll see a jockey and he seems to hit the horse with a bit too much force, and of course the horse ducks a little bit and he'll swerve to one side and maybe lose a bit of momentum. So sure, it can be, if it's badly used, the whip can have a negative effect. But if whip used properly doesn't hurt the horse, particularly these days, the way it's all cushioned, and horses only barely feel a little sting, but it's enough just to make them go, and then the jockey waving the whip after that sometimes is enough to keep them going. So I think you have to get away from this myth that the horses are being hurt.
Yeah. On the basis then, John, that it's a case of just making people keep within the rules, would you be with the band of people that might say disqualification is the only way to make people stick within the rules?
No, that's totally unacceptable. You cannot disqualify a horse because the jockey, say, hits the horse 13 times instead of 12 or something ridiculous like this. You can't expect owners to spend an awful lot of money paying the likes of me and my staff to train horses for them at very little reward for them, and then someday they win a race by a neck and a tight finish, and the jockey, as I say, gives the horse 1 crack or 2 cracks too many according to the rules, and then they're thrown out and they lose everything. That would be unacceptable, and it would be a totally ridiculous extreme to go to, and people wouldn't put up with it.
OK, John, look, thank you very much for joining our show today.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
That is John Ox. John, quick reaction to that. He is one of the great trainers of all time. What would you say to him after that?
No question. John Ox, a great gentleman, one of racing's real professionals, knows the game, but he's been brought up with a whip. If the time would come, I'd like to ask John, if the time came that either the Irish government or, is more likely, a court case, because the whip's going to be banned. We're talking about a thing that's on the way out. It needs just one court case,
again,
one government.
That's your opinion.
No, but that's going to happen.
Well,
we're not going to be whipping horse in 20 years' time. Would John, if it was brought in this year, give up training? Would other people give up training? If he would, it'd be sad to lose him, other people would come in.
He did say in that interview it would be the end of racing.
Well, that's absurd. Absolutely, totally absurd.
In your opinion, it's
absolutely absurd. That if we didn't have the whip anyway, say we've been brought up for centuries not to have the whip, hitting horses. And by the way, John, keeping horses straight, of course, hold it in the reins. Nobody's saying a whipless race. It's hitting horses. That is what none of us get. We're in the racing family. We don't understand the outside impact. Grand National was a big part of it. Lester Piggott's driving, Pat Eddery sometimes cracking into horses. That turns people off, especially women, understandably so. We cannot go on like this.
We'll find out if it does. Because
we can't go on like this.
We'll find out because we'll speak to Paul Struthers later in the show and see if crowds are down this year.
Yeah, but the BHA...
But the crowds must be down if we're scaring people off, mustn't they?
Yeah, but the BHA never make a hard decision anyway. They are frightened to go in because the trainers, John Reid and all of you people would be an absolute uproar.
But you would agree under your logic there must be less people going racing every week.
Not less.
Surely, because you've just said we're scaring people away.
No, it's not less. You can say we can go back to 20 or 30 years how many people used to come. The times have changed.
Right.
There's so much more
But if we're scaring them away, there have to be less people going, yeah?
It's putting people off, stopping people come, the new family of racing, stopping women coming. They don't like to see it. You go by the last hurdle or fence, which is a spectacular place to go, and you hear the crack of the whips and all that. It turns people off. If you can't see it, racing doesn't get it. It is wrong morally.
John, does it turn people off, or indeed is that the beauty of the sport? And actually, it's a beautiful sound. It's great to see a jockey in full motion.
I don't think it turns anybody off. I mean, I think we're talking about a minority that don't want.
It may turn John off, but it doesn't necessarily turn everyone else off.
No, I don't think it does. You only got to look at how many people going racing. I mean, what was it, York the other day, 40,000? I don't think anybody was there complaining about the use of the whip.
Well, we'll speak to Paul Struthers and find out exactly whether people are leaving the sport in droves or not. But
I mean, John Ox said himself, he's a vet, and he loves his horses like every other trainer. And if the horses were coming back and they were upset and didn't get over it for a week, he wouldn't be wanting his horses hit so many times. But he said himself, it doesn't affect their attitude, it doesn't affect their mind. They come out the next day, they're fine, and they don't become worse people or worse horses. So if that was the case, and they were running worse the next time and didn't want to come out the box and didn't like people or wouldn't eat, you would have a problem. But that's not the case.
And it's just maybe, from what you're saying, it's just trying to educate everyone as much as we can about what is good and what might not be so good in the sport. We'll speak to more industry officials after this. Well, the British Horse Racing Authority are currently leading on reviews of both the Grand National meeting and, of course, the whip situation. Paul Struthers is the head of communications at the BHA. And I wonder, Paul, how we're getting on with the review.
The review's going well. As you know, it's a review that actually started last year. We were in discussions internally and with the Professional Jockeys Association and with the welfare organisations. So the consultation period is almost over. We're waiting for the results of some public opinion polling that we've undertaken by an independent organisation. We're waiting for the results of that, and we should be finished the consultation period in the next couple of weeks or so, a little bit more than that. And then it's time for us to get our heads together and decide what we're going to do, factoring in all that, all the consultation that we've had, and people have been very, very constructive, I have to say.
What kind of people are you talking to?
Be quicker to say who we're not talking to, I suspect, Matt. We've spoken to trainers, to jockeys, to the owners, to the race courses. As I say, we've done the polling. We've spoken to individual members of the press who have particularly strong feelings on it. We've spoken to the welfare organisations, anyone else who's expressed an interest in speaking to us. So we've spoken to Toaster, and it may well be even after this first stage we speak to a few more people. I don't know, but it's been pretty wide-ranging and it's taking up an incredible amount of our time.
Who are the people complaining about the current status quo? In other words, who has said to you things have got to change?
I don't necessarily think it was people who said to us things have got to change. As I said, we were reviewing the situation last year, and certainly speaking to the welfare organisations, they had some very specific concerns. We had our own concerns, and as you'll know, Matt, and as everyone knows, it seemed to be that every major meeting, something flared up about the use of the whip. We know that animal rights organisations lobby very hard against it, but they lobby very hard against racing, and they would see racing not exist, so that's unsurprising. And I think even though we were going ahead with our review at the time, what happened in the Grand National and subsequently Toaster's announcement really brought it into focus.
We hear people say on a frequent basis, people don't like to see horses hit with a whip. That seems to be one of the main reasons for the sort of anti-whip brigade. They will bring that argument up. You'd think if that was the case, people would be leaving the sport by the dozens. Racecourse attendances would be down if it's something that disgusts people. Is that the evidence you have? Are racecourse attendances down?
I think there are a number of things I would pick up there. Coming first on attendances, Matt, attendances this year are up. Overall attendance up to the end of June is up 4.6%. Average daily attendance is up 1%. Looking specifically at Toaster, for example, on their ladies' evening this year, they had just over 5,500. On their ladies' evening last year, they had just over 5,200. On their ladies' evening 6 years ago, they had just over 5,500 again. Now, ladies' evenings, as you well know, and I know you do work at Toaster, are very dependent often on the weather as well. So it's not scientific. The other thing we should be looking at is, it's like if you ask people the question, do you beat your wife, they're going to say no. So are there going to be times when the use of the whip is of concern to people? The answer is yes. And the Grand National was an example where, even before we'd announced that there'd been an inquiry and a suspension for Jason Maguire, people had expressed their concerns. Compare that to the previous year, AP McCoy, I don't think we had any complaints about his use of the whip in the Grand National, and he went on to win Sports Personality of the Year. So I think it's a very false premise for people to say people don't like seeing horses hit with a whip, therefore they won't come racing, therefore we should ban it, because it isn't as simple as that. And one of our jobs as part of this review is to look scientifically, or as scientifically as we can, at the issue, get a real gauge of what public opinion is through the polling that we're doing, and look at any research that's been done throughout the world on the whip and the effect the whip has in racing, and also look to consider what research we might want to be doing going forward. And I know there's a couple of areas that Professor Tim Morris is looking at where we'll hopefully be doing some research over the coming 12 months.
Okay, we'll get to possibly that little point in a moment. Jockeys on the Sidelines is always a very interesting read in the Racing Post. Not, of course, a written piece of prose, but just factual evidence of what jockeys are either suspended or injured. At the time of the Grand National and in recent months, people have said, it's ridiculous. We've got 70 jockeys out of action at the moment, either injured or suspended. Some of those suspensions will be, of course, due to breaking the whip rules. It's noticeable that we're in a very, very busy period of racing at the moment, but there appear to be less jockeys suspended than I can remember for a long, long time. You could count it up to around 40 odd at the moment, and we can get up to the 70s and 80s in the past. Again, is there any evidence that since the, for want of a better phrase, hoo-ha, since the Grand National, that jockeys have taken on board what could happen if they don't ride within the rules, and they are actively becoming more responsible to do so?
I'll be perfectly honest, in the time since we spoke earlier today, I've not been able to get statistics for post the Grand National. Certainly looking at the statistics for this year up to now compared with last year, we're broadly at the same level of offending rate. So I wouldn't be able to say one way or another categorically, because I've just not been able to look at those specific figures post-April. But you make a very good point, and it's one that we've been making to the jockeys for several years now, and that is clearly coming through this review. And as I said, we have very constructive meeting with both flat and jump jockeys. Is that this has always, quite literally, been in their hands, and for one reason or another, they, not all of them, but some of them have been transgressing the rules too often, and we've had a relatively high, but still across the board, a low proportion of offences, i.e. the number of offences to ride. If there are 95,000 to 100,000 runners a year, the number of offences that incur a suspension that you're looking at is somewhere in the region of 600. And they are very, relatively minor offences, 1 or 2 day suspensions. If you look at over the last 5 years, for example, how many horses have been wheeled by the use of the whip? And I think the figure's around 10, from almost 500,000 horses that have run. So as we've consistently said, the use of the whip within racing, whilst it's a welfare issue, because of the rules, it's not a welfare problem. But at the same time, the message coming through loud and clear, and especially from welfare organisations, is that you really need to get a grip of it and simply reduce the number of offences that you're having, and ensure that the rules you've got and the penalty structure that you have in place really incentivises jockeys not to break the rules and has adequate punishments when they do, but protects the horse to ensure that we remain in that situation where it's not a welfare problem and it isn't cruel.
Yeah, obviously, while a review going on, a little bit like when a court case is going on, it's not always easy for the officials to really talk that much about it. So we thank Paul Struthers, the head of communications from the BHA, coming on. Fascinating that you're saying crowds are up, more people are going racing than ever before, which rather blows your theory out the door that we're driving people droves away.
Yawn. Yet another BHA review. They're doing, how many reviews have they done? How many discussion
We're talking about
papers?
the whip.
How many focus focus groups have they done? We've had reviews of the whip down the ages, and they've changed the whip rules, changed the whip, given various penalties, various strokes you can hit it. On and on they go. They can't face up to the reality. It is going, it has got to go for our own decency, for our own moral standing.
Well, we know you feel like that.
It's going to go. They're trying to prevent it. And they give ground here, give ground here. It is a thing, there is no compromise here. You can't say the number of strokes you give. In your eyes, there is no compromise. No, there's no compromise. And they keep on penalising jockeys, and they seem for excessive use of the whip. How many jockeys are now unable to ride for 2 days, 3 days? Excessive? It makes no difference. They're going on and on with the review instead of facing up to the reality of what they should do and what they must do.
John, some of us might feel that as this is an issue that might affect horse racing as we know it forever, that a thoroughly professional review is necessary.
I think it's one of them things that has to be looked at and kept under the microscope, because we don't want it certainly don't want the whip to disappear. And the whips we've got now, you could hit a horse a lot more times and not damage it at all in a race. I mean, for instance, the Frankie Dettori thing that a lot of this blew up about, he hit the horse a lot of times.
That's rewilding.
I thought he rode an exceptionally good race. It didn't look
so did John McCririck.
Bad.
Did, yeah.
Yes,
after the race.
Yeah, he rode a very good race. Yeah. He did hit it obviously too many times, which is what you've got to stop. I think he probably would have won the race anyway, even if he hadn't hit it so much. Frankie's a very, very good rider, but he got into that sort
rhythm.
of that rhythm, smack, 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 and he was only just smacking it. He wasn't hitting it that hard.
Almost flicks rather than smacks.
They were, but it's not acceptable, John.
That's an extraordinary statement.
Well, let's
in favour of the
John,
whip.
just for the sake of the viewers, let's just have a look at this. Frankie's on the outside in the dark blue, 3 from the back. That's rewilding, white noseband, easy to see on the right. Ryan Moore on the left on So You Think. One could argue, John, that Ryan Moore hits So You Think with much more ferocity, for want of a better word, than Frankie does on rewilding. And yet, because he didn't hit it as many times, Ryan is legal and Frankie is not.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a fine line. Like I say, when you hit them with these sticks, they're not going to do any damage anyway. But Frankie's just got it. He's got his horse on a roll. I think if he had stuck to the rules, he would still have won the race. I don't think he wouldn't have won the race. Well, but I'm just saying, I'm defending the whip here, John. The whip was still necessary to get that horse into full gear. Frankie just got a little carried away and kept topping away.
I'm interested, John, though, watching this race here, as we all did. The crowd roaring, everyone on television and forums saying that is one of the best races I've seen for a long time. Why does this offend you now you look at it again? What do you find offensive about it?
I accept what you say, and you do get carried away and you admire the skill, the tremendous skill.
Isn't it beautiful?
Is
it not beautiful to watch?
For hitting the horse. But you use the word ferocity. You use the word ferocity for Ryan Moore.
I did that for emphasis in this instance.
Yeah, but nevertheless, that's the word you use. That's what people say.
But I did that
deliberately. And John virtually says that whatever he'd have done, Frankie would have won on rewilding if he hadn't had the whip. And that we'll never know. No. We'll never know if either of them hadn't. But would the race been any worse if they hadn't used the whip? Of course it wouldn't have been any worse.
Well, I don't think
how do you know that?
No. Well, how do you know it?
But that's my point.
We don't. Well, John was saying...
But we know horses need a whip to encourage them. What? We know that. That's fact.
Well, human beings could do things if they're being hit and being beaten. They'll do things. I was beaten at Harrow many, many times. It made me the man I am.
Okay.
But you can't advocate it now. You can't go and hit kids.
Yeah, not hard enough. Right. Okay. Right. Let's go and hear from a man who knows about the game better than certainly most of us. Sir Mark Prescott, I went down to see in Newmarket. He gave us these thoughts.
As always with all questions of animal welfare, logic can often disappear. So the fascinating thing about recent debates have been that John McCririck, who was a fearless supporter of hare coursing, has long been anti the whip. Paul Haig, who's always been of the view that the horses can't be whacked often enough as long as they win when he's in the betting shop.
Paul is the former Racing Post journalist.
Yeah, old Paul was all for that, but was very anti-hunting and coursing. So it's always resulted in strange views that are hard to marry together.
There'll be people watching, though, who will say, well, he's got a point. How can you hit a horse with a whip? Why do we need the whip?
I think you need the whip because if you don't have the whip, the wrong sort of horses win the races. They tend to be how many Persian punches, how many double triggers would win without the whip. The answer is very few. So most horses need an impulsion of some sort, and what we're seeking to do is to get a reasonable level that will allow all kinds of horses to show their best without any threat of them being abused, and without the public spectacle in the big races, which, let's face it, most people only see our big races, the public spectacle of the big races being acceptable to all but the maniacs.
So what's the solution?
I think the solution is to have the whip. I think the whip is required for most horses to exert themselves in the closing stages of a race. I think we should have a fixed number. I would go for 5 or 6. And that would be strokes behind the saddle, which is a deliberate move. So if the jockey exceeds that, he would lose the race. Now he can apply the 5 or 6 strokes whenever he thinks appropriate, but that is the maximum, and if he exceeds it, he loses the race. Now you'd have a squall and a squeak when that happens at Southwell in February. You'd have another outcry when it happened at Newbury in April. But after that, everybody would know the rules. And this would mean that your finishes were still exciting, as they aren't in Norway, in my opinion. A lazy horse, it would be enough to make him produce his best. A nervous horse, it wouldn't exceed it. So as a horseman, I think 5's about right. If you don't have the whip in public, as in some Scandinavian countries, only the highly strung horses win races. And I'm afraid from my own experience, although years ago, there was no doubt that the trainers frighten the horses before the race to try and get them to go in the race. So I think you need the whip, you need it to be used, you need it to be used sparingly and correctly, and you need the jockeys not to be blackmailed into exceeding it in a close finish. And at the moment, in a big race on the big day, when a jockey's involved in a close finish, the fellow next to him is exceeding the rules. What is he to do? So you wind up each one exceeding the rules more and more. And this results in a spectacle that nobody wants to see.
So having a definite cut-off, you think, is absolutely crucial, so everyone knows, whether they're an owner, a trainer, someone who's gambled their horse, that their jockey can only do so much, and after that it's illegal, and whether they back their horse or not, their horse will be chucked out.
They will lose if he exceeds it, so the pressure on the jockey is only to decide when to apply it rather than whether or not to break the rule. He knows if he breaks the rule, he will lose it. And at the moment, the whip rule is quite extraordinary. It is the only rule which can affect the result of a race, as we've seen frequently this year, the breaking of which cannot result in you losing the race. It's the only single rule that applies. It's completely illogical to have it as we have.
There are, of course, other sports, football for instance, where you can foul and break the rule, but it doesn't necessarily affect the whole result of the race. Some people, of course, would argue that actually using the whip hinders a horse rather than helps them. So rather than speeding them up, you might be slowing them down. What would you say to that?
I don't think, first of all, I've never been to a football match, so I've got no comment. Secondly, with regard to it slowing a horse down, I think that
Swaying in the Breeders' Cup,
that only applies when it is incorrectly applied.
Right.
So correctly applied, I think there's no doubt that the application of the whip properly applied at the right time encourages a horse and causes no problem.
On the sticks themselves, we know there have been huge advances over the last few years. If you've watched a dodgy movie or anything like that, it's not the kind of whip immediately that might spring to mind. Very padded. Horses do feel them though, don't they?
Oh yes, and obviously they don't. The whip doesn't serve its purpose unless they do. But
some say it's the movement. It's the sensation that something might happen rather than the actual contact.
And it's the idea of it. And as at school, when that master used to flex his cane, it had a wonderful effect on me, staying awake and paying attention. So yes, I think the very act of swinging a whip concentrates a horse's mind, never mind actually hitting it. So yes, I think that most horsemen would concede that the whip is beneficial. Most would concede that If it's exceeded, it is not beneficial, and some way has got to be devised to make it acceptable to most people. I've always felt that the thinking horseman and the thinking anti, there's not much between them. They've both got a real love of horses, and what we need to find is the common ground, and I would suggest that what I've said is probably the easiest solution to it. You're never going to cater for the maniac who thinks that it's cruel to have pets. You're never going to cater for the serious punter in the betting shop who can't have it hit off often enough. You've got to discard them and find a solution somewhere in the middle, which is clear, everybody knows what they're doing, and the stewards and authorities have the guts to stand up and enforce it.